Hi everyone. In this video, I'm going to explain about API trigger in Power Automate. An API trigger starts a Power Automate flow when an external application or service calls it over HTTP. The flow exposes an endpoint that a caller can invoke. If needed, data can be passed in the request and a response can be received. Now I'll show this API trigger in Power Automate. I'll create a new flow, instant cloud flow. For trigger, I'll choose when an HTTP request is received. Yeah. So if I click on manual, then first is we are having who can trigger this flow. For now, I will choose the second one, which is anyone. So anyone can trigger this flow. It doesn't involve any authentication. This HTTP URL, this is blank for now. When I'll save this flow, at that time we will get this HTTP URL. And before saving, I'll add a compose activity because we need to have at least one action in the flow. So I have saved my flow. And if I go back to this manual, then we can see this HTTP URL has been populated. And we have to call to this URL in order to trigger the flow. So I'll copy this URL. I'll use Postman to call the flow. I'll set the method as post. And if I click on send, we can see status is 202 accepted, which means the flow has been triggered. So here we can see this flow has been triggered. So next I'll show how to pass parameters to this flow and also how can this flow return a value. So I'll make updates so that this flow receives two numbers as input and it returns the sum as output. So for that, first we have to update this request body JSON schema. So I'll use a sample payload to generate the schema. So it will receive two numbers, this number 1 and number 2. So it has generated the schema and I will initialize one variable. And its value should be the sum of number 1 and number 2. Now for returning this sum variable, I will add one response action. Here we can set the status code which we want to return, so it will 200. We can set headers also in case we want to return any specific headers. And in the body, I will set the value which we are going to return. So I'll save this flow. So this flow will receive two numbers as input and it will return the sum of those two numbers as output. Now we'll test this flow. I'll copy this URL. And in the body, I will pass the JSON. And if I make this request, then we can see we got the response as sum as 300. We can verify our flow also. So yeah, it has triggered. Yeah, so the response, it has written this response also, it has written it as 300. In the trigger, we are having this method field and it has different methods. Whatever method we set here, our calling application should also call with the same method. For example, if we set the method as get here, then our calling application should also call with get method. And the default method is post. So if we don't set anything, the default method is post. And also we have to follow the general conventions. For example, if the method is get or delete, then we will not be able to pass anything in the request body. Next, I will explain this relative path field in the trigger. Relative path field add extra text to the trigger URL and optionally pass parameters through it. For example, let's say this is the trigger URL without the relative path. And if we add this in the relative part, this add slash number one and number two, then same will be added in the trigger URL also. As we can see here, it has been added. And while making the API call to trigger the flow, we have to pass the actual value of this number one and number two. So here we can see 100 and 200 has been passed. So this value can be used in our flow. So I'll show the flow also. So I have created this flow and here I have set this relative path as number one and number two. And again, I am adding both the numbers. So in this, I have initialized this sum variable and here I am adding this number one and number two. And then I am passing the response using this response activity. Now I'll call this flow also. I'll go to Postman. Here, instead of number 1 and number 2, I will pass values. I will pass 30 and 20. And we can see the sum is 50. And we can verify our flow also. So it has been triggered. And you can see it has passed sum as 50. Next, I will explain the concept of polling a flow in Power Automate. In previous example, the flow executed very quickly because it only involved adding two numbers. However, there may be scenarios where a flow takes much longer to complete, for example, 1 or 2 hours. In such cases, it is not practical for the calling application to wait that long for a response. Instead, an asynchronous approach is recommended where the calling application can initiate the flow, receive a job or request ID, and periodically check that status until the flow is complete. I'll show how to implement this asynchronous calling approach. So this flow is same as our first flow where it receives two integers in the API response body. It adds the two numbers and returns the sum as the output. And I have added a delay to this flow. So it will delay for 4 minutes. And in the response, if I go to settings, then I have turned on this asynchronous response. And the description of this field explains it very well. Asynchronous response allows a flow to respond with a 202 to indicate the request has been accepted for processing. A location header will be provided to retrieve the final state. So we have to keep on calling the location header to check the status of the job. So I'll run this flow. I'll copy the trigger URL. I'll pass the parameters also. Method is post. And if I send this, and we can see the status is 202, which is the flow has been triggered. We can check the flow also. So yeah, it is running. And if I go to headers, then here we can see we are having this location field, and we have to keep on calling this location URL to check the status of the flow. If I call this URL, then we can see the status is 202. So it means the flow is still running. So after the job completes, it should be 200, and we will get the sum also. So we will wait for 4 minutes. Now we can see that our flow has completed. And if I again call the URL, then we can see we have got the output, which is the sum, and also the status code is 200. So this is asynchronous calling. Till now, in all our examples, the who can trigger the flow field was set to anyone, which means the HTTP endpoint does not require any authentication. Now, let's look at any user in my tenant option. With this option, the caller must authenticate, and the caller must belong to the same Microsoft Entra ID tenant as the flow. There are two ways a caller can authenticate in this scenario. First, an actual user can interactively authenticate and invoke the Power Automate flow. Second, an application can authenticate using a Microsoft Entra ID app and invoke the flow using the app's service principal identity. For this demonstration, instead of having a human user interactively call the endpoint, we will use an external application. The application authenticates with Microsoft Entra ID using the client credential grant. The resulting token represents the application service principal, and that token is used to call the Power Automate endpoint. To demonstrate this programmatic scenario, we will first create a Microsoft Entra ID app registration. In this slide, I have shown the steps for creating the app registration. You can pause the video and refer to these steps. This is the Entra ID app which I have created. And first we need to create access token using the details obtained from this app. I'll go to Postman, and this is the URL we have to use to create the access token. This code here is the tenant ID of my Entra ID app, and these are the parameters we have to pass. And if I click on send, then it has created this access token. This access token I have to pass in my API to trigger the Power Automate flow. So I'll copy the URL from this Power Automate flow. I'll paste. I'll add access token. Method should be post. I need to pass the body also. I need to pass number 1 and number 2. And if I send the request, we have received the output. We can verify our flow also. We can see the flow has been executed. If I go to Microsoft documentation, then here we can see it is mentioned, if you restrict the workflow to be triggered only by authenticated user, ensure the HTTP request contains the correct claims. The required claims are in the following list. So these are the claims detail we have to pass. And in our API request, these details are contained in the access token. So if I copy the access token and if I paste this in this jwt.io, then we can see all those informations are contained in this access token. We can see we are having this audience, ISS, OID, and also TID also. So this access token contains all those required claim details. And finally, we will look into the third option, which is specific users in my tenant. If we select this option, then this allowed user field will appear. We will see the Microsoft documentation for specific users in my tenant option. So this is the documentation. It is mentioned ensures that only specific user's ID from the same tenant can trigger this workflow. Enter email address of the specific users in the allowed users field. You can also enter object IDs of the service principal user if you intend to use this flow to be triggered by only by a SPN user. In our case, this SPN user is the case. So I have updated the object ID of my Entra ID app here. In my PPT, I have listed the steps how to obtain this object ID. And now I will invoke this flow using HTTP trigger. I'll copy this URL and I'll paste here. My access token is still active from my last request, so no need to regenerate. Body I am passing number 1 and number 2. Yeah, if I have sent, then we can see the output. We can verify the flow also. We can see it has been triggered. Now let's update this object ID and we'll see what happens. Instead of this object ID, I'll add some random test object ID. Save my flow. Now again execute the same flow. So I am getting this error, mismatching auth claims. So this is all about HTTP trigger in Power Automate. If you like this video, then please give it a like. Thank you.